Hello, everyone, and thank you once again for joining us for another Prides podcast series. I'm so excited to be joined today by Nick Burton. And Nick, before we get started, please introduce yourself, share your pronouns, and tell our listening audience a little bit more about who you are and the work that you do.
Yeah. Thanks, Wally, for having me. And I'm excited to be a part of this podcast series. I think it is definitely needed, particularly with what's going on around us right now at the state and federal level, depending on where you live. So my name is Nick Burton, and I have been in the intellectual and developmental disability space for about 26, 27 years. I was first welcomed in by family. I had a cousin with a developmental disability. He lived at home with some of my family, and I remember him just being present all the time at family functions. He lived at home. He received care 24/7 from my aunt and uncle. That was well before there were personal support workers or DSPs to be with him at home. And so they did a lot of that work. And then my mom actually was a manager at a residential group home back in the 80s and would bring me to work with her on the weekends. There weren't a lot of rules back then about children coming to work with you. And so I would go hang out with her and we'd go out in the community. I'd cook dinner with people that lived in the residential group home. And then I actually started as a direct support professional working with teenagers, teenage boys in a residential group home, and then have since moved up into case management roles, state leadership roles, and most recently, I was the director of programmatic services for the Maryland Developmental Disabilities Administration. And about a year and a half ago, I left and opened up my own consulting firm. And so I do a lot of consulting with provider organizations that are providing home and community-based services to people with developmental and intellectual disabilities. And then most recently, I just launched a nonprofit organization to expand clinical knowledge and skill capacity to best support people with intellectual and developmental disabilities and co-occurring mental health conditions.
Wow, that is a lot. Impressive. And first of all, that's pretty cool. And
Yeah.
secondly, thank you for all of that work. We are all champions in this work, as we say, and which is, leads into the conversation that your topic, included and welcome people to conversation of championing change and building inclusive policies and culture. Nick, if you could share with me and the rest of the audience what an inclusive culture looks like or how it appears for you and for organizations or, anyone who's building an inclusive culture. What does that look like? What is it?
Yeah. Well, I think it starts, my thinking around that really starts about where I grew up and how I grew up. I grew up in Montana and noticed that maybe I was not like other boys early on, and understood that the world, particularly in a small town in Montana, was not geared towards me and how I thought of myself and who I wanted to like or love or be in a relationship with. And, certainly times have changed, but there are certainly spots even now across the United States where you have to be really careful about who you are and what you do. And certainly there's been an attack on the trans community thus far. And so I think when we think about champion change or inclusive spaces, what that really means is how do we give people the space to be who they are? And when I think about what that means in terms of the work that we all do in terms of supporting people with disabilities, I think about person-centeredness. And person-centeredness really says, how do you receive what you need to be your most successful and to achieve what you want in life? And I also think about equity, the principles of equity. And equity really says, how do you receive support to break down the barriers so that you can achieve what you want in life. So you can't have person-centeredness without equity, and you can't have equity without person-centeredness in my mind, because one says, what do you want to achieve and how can I help you get there? And the other says, what are the barriers that we need to help you break down to be able to achieve those things? And so when I think about my own life and I think about the lives of others who may be struggling with their identities or, struggling with access from a disability perspective, I go back to thinking, how do we help people and agencies and systems understand that parallel connection between equity and person-centeredness? And then how do we start to create policies, cultures, systems, processes, procedures that reflect those values?
Yeah, and they're all, thank you for that, Nick, because they're all connected and they're also important. So, think about the importance of it. Why is it so critically important now more than ever, but also beyond, right? This is the now, but that is the continuation of this conversation. Why is it so important for organizations and, from an employee perspective, for employers to really embrace changing policies, creating an inclusive culture, all of that? And you talked about what that exists, but why is it so important
Yep.
right now for organizations and employers to embrace this concept?
Yeah. Well, because it's about people. There's a person on the other end of whatever you want to call it, DEI, diversity, inclusion, equity, whatever we call it, whatever we label it, there's a person on the other end of it that just wants to be able to live their life, right? And when we look at systems, and I've been involved in state systems and federal systems for years and years and years, an old friend of mine used to say, the inequities and the discrimination is baked into the system, and we have to unbake it. We have to be able to create policies that actually meet the needs of people today, right? So when we look at agencies that are supporting people with developmental disabilities, we know that developmental disabilities don't exist in a vacuum, right? We know that people with disabilities also struggle with co-occurring mental health conditions. We also know that people with disabilities have and identify as being on the GLBTQ spectrum, right? We know those things. Do our policies meet their needs? Do our policies meet the needs of the staff that are supporting people that we are working with, right? If you look at the most recent ICI IDD survey, there is the women make up the predominant caregivers for people with disabilities, and it's often women of color who are 46 years old. And so are your policies meeting their needs as well? We have to really look at who we're supporting and who we're employing to make sure that the policies meet their needs so that they can continue to do the work that we've asked them to do so that they can continue to thrive in their community and that we can continue to grow as an organization and as a society where we respect and value the differences that we all bring to the table, because it just strengthens the work that we do. And if we don't work on changing how we think about policies or procedures, we're going to keep doing the same thing over and over and over again. And that's the definition of insanity.
Right, right. And thank you, Nick. And I love what you said about how inequities are baked into the system, because I've always believed that when someone says the system is broken, I say, no, it was created that way. It was built that way. And so when we think about how we champion change, and I love what you said, there's a person behind it. We get so caught up in sometimes the jargon and making sure that things are aligned and things. So for someone who's listening, how can they be a change agent in this? What are some things that you can say based on the work you do, but also wherever they live or whatever their place? Because I think a lot of times that sometimes people feel like, well, it's not my responsibility, or that my voice isn't loud enough, or I don't have a place. What would you say to people who say that, Nick? And what would you say as points of advice or guidance for people who want to be change agents in this one?
Yeah. So I think there's a spectrum of ways to be a change agent. I think the first spot is every single one of us that are listening to this podcast or they're participating in this podcast probably know somebody with a disability, probably know somebody on the GLBTQ spectrum, probably know somebody with a co-occurring mental health disorder, right? And given that, how do you show up for that person? How do you make sure that they know you're there for them and that you love them and that you support them and that you'll stand up for them, right? How do they know that? How have you made that known to those people? I think there's other ways to do it too. If you are in a position of power, how are you encouraging your agencies to look at the policies and procedures you're developing, right? Do you have a rubric to review your policies and procedures to ensure that they're not harming people, that there aren't power imbalances, right? That people have an input and are at the table while those policies are being developed? If you're in charge of state systems, what does it actually mean to gather input from the people that are going to be affected by those policies? We often hear in the disability community, nothing about me without me. But oftentimes, state systems, when they reach out to get input, they release a 490-page document and say you have 45 days to provide comments on it. And this is going to affect the services that you're able to access within our system. And yet people who have vision difficulties, people who have hearing difficulties, people that don't speak that language, people that may not have access to the internet are left out of that process to be able to provide input into the services that are going to affect their life. I think, recently I think about the state of Maryland. There's been a lot of discussion over the last couple of months about budget cuts within the developmental disability system. And the community has really come together here, and it culminated on a march of 2,000 people with disabilities, direct support professionals, families coming together to fight for change. And the result of that was a significant portion of those cuts was restored. And so when we think about this from the context of people on the GLBTQ spectrum, right now, what are we doing to stand up and say, no, it's important for us to talk about DEI. It's important for us to talk about how the diversity of our employees, the diversity of the people that we support makes us better. How do we invite those diverse tables to the conversation to say, what are our policies going to be about who we support, what we support, and what we stand out on, right? I work with an agency right now that has a member of the trans community on their staff. And they've been very inclusive of that staff member to say, how do you feel comfortable about us talking about what's happening right now in the country? That's being very inclusive of that person and having their voice at the table, because ultimately what the agency decides to do or not do is going to affect them. And the zeitgeist right now is to say, no, we're not going to talk about any of that. And I think we have to push back on it.
Yeah, and I thank you. And I think it's really interesting how you broke down that everyone has a role in this, whether you think you're not. If this is something that drives your passion, if you are connected or a member of or know someone with a disability, someone with like you said, with a co-occurring mental disorder, or someone who's part of the queer community and that conversation. And you kind of ended in this thought there, and I want you to kind of, if you could dive it for me. And this is kind of selfish for me, but there's this swirling and swarming that's going around with the changes, and it happens. It's changing every time. And I think there are many people who are listening, myself included, who are always like checking to see what's happening now, what's changing now. And of course, this could change. If someone's listening to this podcast 7, 8 years from now, they might be like, what are you talking about? But for now, how do people either kind of be in a space that can still make those movements without feeling that trap, but also how do we move forward and move on from the noise, like you said, and the swirling of things that are happening? What are your thoughts on that, Nick?
Yeah. It's funny you say noise. I actually wrote an article, gosh, about a month and a half ago after the recent election about the noise regarding DEI and how we all have a role to play to push back on that and to not be told that we shouldn't talk about those differences that really make us quite beautiful as a country and as a society and as a community. Um, and I think where we begin to rise above that noise is we do it with each other, right? We find like-minded people and we do it amongst each other. And we say, Wally, I'm not going to not talk about DEI with you. Will you join me in doing that? It's about people in positions of power saying, no, we're going to talk about it. We're going to continue to engage and talk about the diversity that's a part of our culture. I think also there's some interesting movements happening just across the country with entities that are saying we'll do without federal grants if that means we can't talk about DEI, right? We'll take the heat. And understanding that there's been these moments in history where ultimately there are people that are on the wrong side of an issue. And you think back to the civil rights movement, you think back to the gay rights movement when people said that gay people shouldn't be able to be in bars, shouldn't be able to work for the federal government, shouldn't be able to marry, have sex, right? We pushed above that. We first did it as a small community together, but then we grew and we got people to agree with us and we got people on our side and we found allies. And I think we're in a position where we have to start building allies again as a community to be able to talk about the diversity that makes us so great.
Yeah, I love it. And you know, when we talk about it, keep talking about it because you can change language on a page, but that doesn't erase that we exist. It doesn't remove the fact that people with disabilities, people who are part of the LGBTQ community, people who are um, passionate and who are just vital to the conversation, we're still going to be here. And we're still the ones who will be um, the ones that we turn to for each other, like you said. So everyone listening, we're all part of this work. Nick, I really enjoyed the conversation. Um, if and this is kind of a loaded question, but I love asking it. If you could change one or two or three things right now to improve services or the landscape or even the existence for LGBTQ people with disabilities, what would that be?
Oh my goodness, that is a loaded question.
Yeah, my apologies, but
Yeah,
I am
that's
intrigued.
great.
So,
Um, I think a few things. One is, I wholeheartedly believe in person-centeredness and what that truly means and the values of person-centeredness, the values of autonomy, choice, control, um, coming from a place of strength from a person. And I think that as a system, we've talked and talked and talked about being person centered for 30, 40 years. And it's time we actually start to be person centered and create cultures of person centeredness that really do value a person's autonomy to be who they want to be who they are, and live their life on their own terms. And I think we run into these situations where we say we're person centered, but then, oop, 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 health and safety, you can't wear a dress in the community. Health and safety, you can't go out with a guy. You can't have unprotected sex with someone you don't know, right? You can't go march in a gay pride parade. Yes, they can, to all of the above. And so, how do we move to a situation where that truly is the conversation we have? And instead of saying, no, you can't do that, you can't make that decision, it's not healthy and safe, do we say, okay, well, let me give you all of the facts and the information so you can make an informed decision about what you're about to do. And if you make a bad decision, it's understandable. I've made bad decisions too. And I think that's one area where how do we stop talking about creating cultures of person centeredness and actually be person centered? I think the other thing too, and this is just for the GLBT community writ large, and I said it as a kid, and I've said it for years and years and years, and you see memes about it all the time. I just would love to come to a place where no one has to come out, right? My
Mhm.
brother didn't come out as straight. My parents didn't come out as heterosexual. My dad didn't come out as cis, white, straight male, right? But yet we ask minorities to define themselves. We ask underrepresented groups to label themselves and to be very clear about who they are and what they stand for. But we don't ask that of really any other group. And so I'd really like to see us not have to do that, that we just recognize that, well, he's a person. Well, he's in love with a man. Great. Well, he didn't have to label that at all for us. Well, he didn't have to make us feel comfortable about who he is and educate us about who he is. And then I think the last thing that I just would hope for people with disabilities who are also on the GLBTQ spectrum is that they can start to also find their voice right now, right? I think when you talk about the fighting that they have to do to just access disability services and the hoops they have to jump through and the constant justification of a need to receive a service just to live and thrive in their communities. On top of that, now they have to contend with the fact that their government is telling them, we're going to potentially cut your services because we can't afford them, but also we're not going to acknowledge or recognize you as a person with a disability. We're not going to talk about person-centeredness. We're not going to talk about GLBTQ issues. You're on your own. And I want to encourage us as a system and as advocates and as supporters to give people voice to say, hell no, I am going to be who I am, and I'm going to access what I need to thrive, and I'm going to be the best version of myself. And that means I am a person with a disability who loves another man, or I am a person with a disability who identifies as trans, and that they can find their voice through this desire to silence people.
Yeah, yeah. So, Nick, I know we've talked a lot about today, and I'm sure we could talk about more, and I'm sure the listeners want to learn more. But is there something that you would like to share that I didn't approach or didn't ask today, that you think people really need to hear?
Yeah, I think that's another loaded question, Wally. I don't think there's anything. I think all this just bears repeating, and I think we have to remind ourselves in this time that it feels like we should retreat, and it feels like we should be quiet, and it feels like we should, even on some level, be ashamed of what we have become and who we have become and where we are at in this world. And I think we should push against that. And I think if we're
Yeah,
tired and we don't have a voice right now, we need to lean on the people that we love and that love us, and that will be that voice for a while until we get that voice back. But I think we have to remember that we can't be quiet about this. We can't just fade into the background, because if we're quiet and we don't stand up for ourselves, people are going to do what they want. And
yeah.
that likely means less for us.
Well, and we learn by repetition, and I love how you say that, because if you think about the changes in the leaders throughout history, you know, what would happen if they were silent, right? And we think about all the ones who helped spark a movement, and we think about Stonewall, we think about the civil rights movement and all of the critical players in that. And we could think, how do we lend our voices and our movements and our actions to all of that, so that it is not just one voice or one perspective, one person. And I think that's very important. This is why this is called the Prides podcast series.
Yeah.
It's that,
You know,
yeah,
I've always, and one thing, I am fortunate to have a lot of really great friendships in my life, but I'll tell you, in times like this, some of the best friends that I have are straight white males who stand up for me and push back and say, I can still be a masculine person. I can still be a straight white male, and I can still have compassion, and I can still love a whole group of people and believe that their rights don't take away from my rights, and we can all have the same rights. And they have become really fantastic allies. And so find those people that are willing to be that ally and that'll stand up for you and be in your corner, because they make an impact for sure.
Love that. Find your allies, find your advocates, find your disruptors, find your interrupters, find all of that. Um, how can people find you or get to learn more about your work, Nick?
Yeah. So I have my own consulting firm called N Burton Consulting. And my email address is nick@nburtonconsulting.com. I also have a nonprofit called Next Gen Synergy, which is a nonprofit dedicated to supporting and building capacity to best support people with intellectual and developmental disabilities and co-occurring mental health conditions. I'm on LinkedIn, I'm on Facebook, I'm on Instagram. So follow, follow, follow.
Follow. All right, everyone. Thank you so much. Thank you, Nick. First of all, thank you, everyone, for listening. This has been another great Prides podcast interview. And please take care of yourself and be kind to yourself and to each other. Be well.